Okay, let's do this. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that all right. Do this. There we go. Okay, well, I thought this morning we'll just keep going and look at a few more passages if we can, just that discuss some of the details of the end times. And last week we only got through Daniel 9 last week, but hopefully we can get a little further. And let me know if my connection is not good. I hope everything is okay here. Some problems. Okay. So last week we looked at a very important passage, Daniel 9, 24 to 27. And why that passage is significant is the level of detail that was described in that text. If you'll remember it predicted basically the time between the completion of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. You remember it said from the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the Messiah. Let me go to that passage, Daniel 9. We talked about these 77s will be decreed, and it said from the rebuilding of Jerusalem until the Messiah Prince, or until the Messiah would be essentially 69 sevens, which came out to 483 years. And we identified that as the time period between when Jesus returned. So this was the, if we look at the number of years, this is what, around 28, AD 28, something like that, which was around the triumphal entry of Christ. Okay, and whoops, need the year here, AD around 28, something like that, 28 to 30. So that prophecy was very specific. So it mentions you remember it's the 70 weeks, or literally the 70 sevens. That's a better way to say it, because they didn't use the term for weeks. They used this, actually it's the number 7, so 70 sevens. And we determined that had to have been years, because it was describing a period of time, but it couldn't refer to days or weeks or months, because it described the Jerusalem being rebuilt, and that didn't happen for over 100 years, or about 100 years later, after Daniel mentioned this prophecy. So we know that the term had to be 7 years rather than 7 weeks or days or months. And based on that, the prophecy very accurately predicted the triumphal entry of Christ, when the Messiah would come. And then also too, in that prophecy, it mentions that the city would be destroyed, okay, which happened not long, excuse me, not long after Christ, right, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And then it spoke of this prince, right, who would come from this people, the Romans, we know them to be, and that he would make this covenant for one week, or 1 7. So there's discussion in that Daniel talks about this 1 7, when the referred to as the prince would make a covenant. And the idea that the many here is probably a reference to with God's people, but then in the middle of the, again, 7, he would break the covenant. And notice it says there, he would basically, there would be an abomination of destruction or desolation. All right, which this is an important term that we need to pay attention to because Jesus is going to refer to it later. Hopefully we'll get to that passage today. And so here the 70 weeks or 77th prophecy is a very significant one in the scriptures because it really lays out essentially the key marks of history and really identifies. And this is why I think, there's often a question here. Why did he split this up? He mentions at the beginning, notice in verse 24, right? He mentions the 77th, right? He says 77s, verse 24. 77s have been decreed. And then when he starts describing the details in verse, where is that? 25, he mentions the 7 sevens plus the 62 sevens. And what was that to be? That was describing the time when Jerusalem, which again, in the context, remember, in Daniel's, at this point in time, Jerusalem is destroyed. It's in ruins, right, from the Babylonians. And so Daniel's reflecting on this earlier in the chapter where he's thinking about they've been in exile, Jerusalem has been ruined, it's destroyed, and now he's praying that God would keep his promise after the 70 years to restore them. And so Daniel's given these details going from, okay, there will be a point where Jerusalem will be rebuilt. And from that time until the Messiah will be these 69 sevens. All right. So that refers to the first coming. Now then the 70th seven, the last seven, isn't mentioned until verse 27, where then we see, he talks about there is the 1/7, and guess what? At the end of that 7 is the second coming. Okay, so in this prophecy, it is marking the two significant events, the first coming and the second coming of the Messiah. The first coming would be marked 483 years or 69 sevens after Jerusalem is rebuilt. So that's the reference point. When Jerusalem is rebuilt, which happened in the days of Nehemiah, from that point, 483 years later, we will see the Messiah, and that's exactly what happens. And then there's this gap of time between the first coming, and nothing's mentioned here in this prophecy about that. Only the second coming is mentioned in reference to that 1 week, that 1/7. Right? So between the sevens, there is this big gap of time. By the way, unknown gap of time, because the significant events are the first and second coming. And so this prophecy centers around that. What would bring in the second coming? Well, it's this 1 week, this 1/7, where the prince, as he's referred to, the prince will make a covenant with God's people, and then in the middle of that 7-year period will break that covenant under what he refers to here as an abomination of desolation. Now, we're not given more details about this person or about these events at this point, but what is significant about the 70 weeks or 77s in Daniel is that they connect to the first and second comings. That's the key events here that it points to. Okay, any questions on that? We talked about a lot more details last week, so you can go back to that video if you want to go through it in more detail. But I just wanted to clarify or emphasize the significance of this prophecy is the pointing to the first and second comings. Now, not much detail about the second coming is given here. All that's said is just that last week, the tribulation week. It doesn't mention the second coming of the Messiah, but until later in Daniel. But any comments or questions before we go to the next? We're going to look at the next passage in Daniel. Any comments or questions?
Nothing.
Okay. Hopefully it makes sense. Jesse understands it perfectly, so that's good. Maybe he can answer any questions you have, all right? Jesse's our prophecy expert. Is my signal coming in okay? You guys can hear me all right?
A little bit choppy, Pastor Tim.
Still choppy?
Yes, it's not good, the signal, Pastor Tim. Morning, Pastor Tim.
Good morning, Kent. Can you hear my audio okay? Or is it just the video, or is it both audio and video?
Choppy. It's a bit choppy.
Both audio and video?
Yeah.
But we
Yes,
can
we can.
understand.
Okay, let me
Go
try
ahead,
this.
we can understand.
All right. How about this? If I cut my video a little bit, how's the audio? Is it clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay. Let me just cut my video. I'll just do audio for a little bit. Hopefully that will help my bandwidth. Okay. Any questions on that? Just summarizing Daniel 9:24-27, those 70 weeks or 77s, the focus is on the first and second coming. Now, more detail of the second coming is given a little bit later in Daniel. And if we go to chapter 11 in Daniel, which is chapter 10, just describes how Daniel was not feeling well, and he was didn't feel like eating. He was restless, and so Gabriel comes in order to give him comfort. And then in chapter 11, we're given details about further prophecy, further future tellings that Daniel is given. So I wanted to focus our attention a little bit on this chapter. So I'm going to ask some of you guys to read a little bit here. So I'm going to start with you, Jesse. If you could read the first 4 verses of Daniel chapter 11.
Will I start reading, Pastor Tim?
Yeah, go ahead. Daniel chapter 11, verses 1-4.
Okay, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be an encouragement and protection of him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And the mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority, which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside them.
Okay, thank you. So what do we learn here in these first 4 verses of this chapter? Daniel says in the first year of Darius the Mede. So this is right after the Persians had defeated the Babylonians, right? You remember the writing on the wall, the hand that was writing on the wall, and it basically was telling Belshazzar that his kingdom was done, that Babylon was over, and the Persians would come. And so this is the first year of the reign of Persia in that region. And what is described here in verse 2? What is Daniel told?
3 more kings are going to arise in Persia.
Yes. So there'll be 3 more kings in Persia. So it's very specific. Then a 4th one will gain far more riches, and he becomes strong, and then he will fight and battle another nation whose name is Greece. All right, this is just like we're going back to that vision of the statue in Daniel chapter 2. So Greece, we know what's going to happen. What does verse 3 say about Greece?
Mighty King.
Mighty king will arise.
Yeah, who is that? Who's he speaking of?
Alexander the Great.
Yes,
Alexander the Great.
exactly. Right. So we have Persia, right, which will, and this is like reign from, what is this, around 536 BC until Greece, Alexander the Great, I think it was around 332 BC. I don't remember exactly, when Greece under Alexander the Great swept through the region, defeating nation after nation. All right. Well, that's what is being spoken of here in verse 3. All right. And then what's going to happen? What does verse 4 predict is going to happen to Greece?
Kingdom will be broken and divided.
Exactly. So Greece ends up being broken up into there becomes four regions.
Yes.
All right. Which later
not
comes
know.
under what this, they're known as the Seleucids. It's a very interesting period of time where you have the north, south, east, and west of Alexander the Great's empire broken up. Alexander the Great did not reign for very long. He swept to power in very quickly, but he also did not hold that power for very long. In fact, I think he died like 10 years later. He died of syphilis, sexual transmitted disease, because he was very promiscuous. But he only reigned for basically about 13 or 14 years. So around 323, the kingdom of Greece immediately split up. And so the rest of in verses, if we kept going in verses 5 through 35, it talks about the events that take place following Alexander the Great, all the way up until one of these rulers in, let's see, verse, what is it, 31. There's a certain king that rises up among one of these 4 kingdoms. Let me have somebody else read. Let's see. Ramil, you want to read verses 31 to 34 here for me?
Okay.
Thank you.
11 verse 31.
31 to 34.
Forces from him will arise. Okay. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by the flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy.
Okay, so
Okay.
hold on one second. So here, right, before this passage was speaking of one of the kings who would rise up. So that's who the him is here in verse 31. And that king will desecrate the sanctuary, All right, what is that? You think
Temple.
that's Jerusalem's temple. All right, and then it says, and do away with the regular sacrifice. All right, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And then by smooth words, he will. So there's this abomination of desolation that takes place, but this one is different than the one Daniel 9 speaks of. Okay. And the reason we know that is because chapter 11, verses 1 and following is speaking of events taking place following the fall of Greece. But this is before the Roman Empire rises up to destroy Jerusalem. If you remember back in Daniel chapter 9, remember it said, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off, and the people of the prince to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay? And then later, the ruler from that people who destroys the city and the sanctuary will make a firm covenant. Okay? That's called the abomination of desolation, abomination that makes desolate. This abomination of desolation is a different one because the city of Jerusalem was not destroyed by this king. Okay, that event did not happen. So let me write a comment here. So this is not the abomination that brings desolation spoken of in Daniel 9, because the city of Jerusalem was not yet destroyed as predicted in Daniel 9:26. Okay, you guys follow me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is some other abomination of desolation. This is some other event that is similar. It was a desecration in the temple, but we learn from history that actually this particular event was done by Antiochus Epiphanes, I think is the fourth, in what was it? Trying to remember, 167, I think, BC, something like that, when he offered a pig on the altar in the temple. And then he blasphemed God, and that is what then brought about the Maccabean revolt, which is where a group of men rose up and led the people of Israel to attack Antiochus Epiphanes, and they succeeded. And this is when Hanukkah began. That's where Hanukkah came from, was in the Maccabean revolt, because during this revolt, there was no priest that was lighting the lamp, the menorah, and yet it stayed lit. So there was no priest, this is how the legend goes, no priest feeding the lamp with oil, and yet it continued to stay lit for like 7 days. And so they saw that as a miracle, a sign from God that he was with his people and gave them victory. And so that's why in Hanukkah celebrates their victory at this time. And the menorah is prominent in this celebration because of the miracle that it stayed lit. So, but this abomination of desolation is not the same one that is coming in the future. Okay, that's another one. Jesus also clarifies that in Matthew 24, which we'll see later. Okay, so I'm just trying to make sure you understand there's a distinction. So all the way up until verse 34, it's speaking of events that take place in the 2nd century. Okay, up until verse 34, it speaks of events between the fall of Greece, okay, which again was around 323, and the Abomination of Desolation. So when Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed the pig, all right, and that was again, I think, if I remember correctly, around 167 BC, somewhere in there. Okay, now in verse 35, there is a shift from the events taking place 200 years or so before Jesus. There's a shift in time, and I want to see if you guys can see it. So Ramil, can you read verse 35, or maybe read verse 34 again, please, and then verse 35,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time.
Okay, that might seem a little mysterious or confusing, but there is a statement here that tells us the this prophecy is now shifting in time. Anybody see it? Verse 35.
Yeah.
In time.
Yes. You guys see that? Notice it says
End time.
until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Okay, so it's sometime in the future now. All right. Remember what I told you. We've said this several times now when we've looked at prophecy. Let me see if I can do this with video now. Try it. The prophets aren't always concerned about doing things consecutively and exactly. They speak of future events. Sometimes, like we saw in Daniel 9, it's pretty precise. And here in Daniel 11 even, verses 1 to 34 is pretty precise and chronological and detailed. Okay. In fact, by the way, many liberal scholars, they hate Daniel chapter 11. And what they do is they say, oh, this clearly shows that Daniel was written later, not in the days of Daniel. Daniel didn't write this. He couldn't have written it because this prophecy is not really a prophecy. It's too exact. So it must have been written by somebody after these events took place. If you read these books, they say Daniel 11 could not have been written by Daniel because it was too correct. That's their argument. Because if you read through the chapter, it is very specific. It mentions 4 kings rising up, and then kings after them, and then the king of the north and the king of the south will do battle. And if you look at history, the history of that region after the fall of Greece, I mean, it's exactly what happens. And so these liberal scholars say, well, there's no way that they could have predicted it this accurately. So therefore, it was not written before the events happened. Okay, obviously.
Pastor Tim, it no longer be a prophecy, it could be an events recording.
I'm sorry, say that again.
If it was been written not in the days of Daniel and they got the accurate details, it could not be a prophecy, it could be an event just like in news.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? Is they're trying to say it wasn't a prophecy, that it was actually a history that was written after the events happened. And their only basis to say that is because Daniel 11 was so accurate. Because they don't believe in miracles. Okay, they don't believe you can tell the future. The liberal scholars don't. And so they just throw out, Daniel didn't write this, somebody else wrote it. Even though the passage clearly says it's Daniel. that Daniel received the vision, and Daniel was or received the explanation. So it did happen. But I'm just saying all that to say this, that in Daniel 11 we do have a very detailed sequential prediction of future events. So the prophets do that at times, but they then often will jump to another point in time, sometimes very quickly. We remember when we looked at Micah 4 and 5, how Micah was going back and forth in time. Well, here in Daniel 11, a similar thing happens between verse 34 and verse 35, where Daniel skips ahead. Okay, up to verse 34, it's talking about events that took place, up to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But then in verse 35, there's a shift, there's a change that he transitions to what he calls the end time and the appointed time. Somebody have a question or comment?
Pastor Tim, verse 35, okay?
Yes.
So, in order to refine words and make them pure, it is essential for them that their insights will form. So, insights there means understanding.
Yeah, I think so.
So, this kind of understanding that is human.
Well, I think he's saying, the ESV translation makes it a little more clear. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, made white until the end time, for it still awaits the appointed time.
Okay, Pastor Tim.
Okay, so he's just transitioning. I think the ESV is a little more clear in the translation. But Daniel's transitioning now from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and in their day, as we go from verse 33 to 34 and then 35, he's moving now from that time to a time even more in the future. Again, this is all future to Daniel. All right, Daniel's writing this, Daniel is writing this around what? 535, 536 BC, right? This is 70 years after the captivity began. So Daniel, in Daniel 11, like 1 to 34, he's speaking of events going from his present day, the first year of Darius the Mede, to the day that Greece defeats Persia through Alexander the Great, to the time that Antiochus Epiphanes desecrates the temple. And then in verse 35, he goes into the future, what he calls the end time, the appointed time. And the reason I bring this up is because, let's look at verse 36. Let me have somebody read verse 36, and let's see, to 37 here. Somebody do that. Let's see who's next. Brother Celito, can you do that? Pastor Boyd?
Reading.
Yeah, can you read verses 36 and let's see. Go ahead and read 36 to 39.
36 to 39.
Yeah, please.
And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the ignition is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. 37. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, or he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of this, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses, with the help of a foreign God. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price.
Okay, let's stop there a minute. So notice verse 36, he makes reference to the king. Okay. Now, if you weren't,
Pastor Tim, I question.
yeah,
Is this king was a reference in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8 and verse 25? Is this the king in reference to Daniel 25, chapter 7, verse 8 and verse 25?
well, let's just look at from Daniel 11 first and see what he had been talking about, a particular king who had committed the abomination of desolation, right? Back in verse 31. All right. And then in verse 36, he's still speaking. He says, and the king shall do as he wills, which makes it sound like it's that same king. But what did we just say in verse 35? There's a jump in time. So this king in verse 36 is a different king. It's not the same king as the one in verse 31. It's not Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a future king that comes in the appointed time at the end. And then notice, how is this king described? In verse 36 and verse 37.
Do as he wills.
Yeah.
Himself.
Yeah, who does this sound like as you read? He shall speak astonishing things against God.
Antichrist.
Yeah.
Final tribulation.
The little
Yeah.
horn. The
What's
little
that?
horn. The little horn.
Yeah, I think so. It's now he doesn't make that connection here, but what Daniel is saying is, look, in the future, at the end, at the appointed time, there's this king who will do whatever he wants. He will exalt himself. He will blaspheme God. He will worship false gods. And in fact, he will magnify himself as a god. Okay? So now, we're not told, we don't see the word Antichrist here, but boy, from other prophecies, this certainly sounds like the guy, right? Now let's look at verse 40. At the time of the end, okay, again, we're at this period of time called the end, and then it continues to describe how this king will become powerful and how he will be given power from others. And then verse 45, let's see, Edwin, I'm going to have you read this. Verse 45, if you could read 11:45 through, let's say, 12:3.
To 12:3, Pastor Tim.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor. Okay. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end. No one will help him. Verse 1, now at the time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. At that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Verse 3.
Yeah, verse 3.
Verse 3. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever.
Okay. So notice what is mentioned here. He, verse 45, shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea, the glorious holy mountain. So he's going to establish, right, his palace in Israel. Okay, so we're again speaking of this future king, and he shall come to his end, none to help him. Notice verse 12 verse 1. This is still part of the same prophecy here, okay? This isn't a new one. Even though there's a chapter 12, really you should ignore that. It's still part of chapter 11 in the sense it's the same prophecy. And notice what it says, at that time. At what time?
Appointed time.
The end, the appointed time, exactly. Remember I told you, when you're studying prophecy, watch for time markers, okay? We got a time marker in verse 35 that told us we were shifting to the time of the end, the appointed time. Now we're in that time period, and this king will rise in power, will exalt himself, and then at that time, so we're still here again at the end time, at the appointed time, Michael the great prince shall arise, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never been seen since there was a nation. All right, well, what do we know that to be?
Pastor Tim, it could be a cosmic war.
Well, he talks about a time of trouble. I think the New American Standard says a time of distress. Okay.
It could be a cosmic war between the Satan and Archangel Michael.
Well, no, notice it says specifically, at that time, your people will be rescued. This is an event. These are going to be events on the earth.
Jacob's trouble.
Jacob's trouble, the tribulation, the final week, and the 70th week, the 70th seven. Okay, I think we can see that this is, Joel talks about this time period as well. Zephaniah mentions this period of time of great judgment. And notice, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. All right, some to everlasting life, others to everlasting contempt or judgment. What are we talking about here, most likely? What does it seem?
End.
This is the end of human history, right?
Yes.
Is this the Great White Throne Judgment, Pastor Tim?
I think so. All right, so he's at the end here, the very end, at least as far as human history is concerned. And then let's see, let's just skip to the very end. You guys can go back and read through this. I'm just trying to pick a few key points or key highlights that are mentioned here. Notice in verse 6, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? Like, when is this going to happen? Is this sort of the question that is posed within this vision? And the answer to that question is given in verse 11. Let's see. Let me ask, hey, Sandy, can you read verses 11 to 13 here? This is very...
Okay, I will read. And from the end that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abominations of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. It is accurate. How blessed is your kids who and attain to 1,355 days. It is literal. But as for you, and this is as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into the rest and rise again from your allotted portions to the end of age. Resurrection.
Okay, so from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished, okay, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. What is verse 11 referring to? Is there anywhere else in Daniel Just think about Daniel only. Anywhere else in Daniel where verse 11 seems to connect?
1.5 week.
Yes. Here,
Chapter 9.
if we go back to Daniel 9,
Chapter 9.
what did he say there? He, who's the he?
Stop the sacrifice.
There's the prince, right?
Antichrist.
In Daniel 11, he's referred to as the king, but he will put a stop to the sacrifice on the wing of abomination, which will come one who makes desolate. So the abomination that makes desolation, or notice in Daniel 11 here, from the time the regular sacrifice is abolished, or maybe I should do this. Let's do this. Now, maybe it'll make it easier. I'm going to put, oh, I already did. Oh, here, I'll do this. I'm going to put Daniel 9:27 right next to it here, just so it's easier to see these together. So you guys can see this because it's important. Okay, so notice Daniel 9:27, the he. Who is that he? In that context, it was the prince. All right. In this context, the regular sacrifice is abolished by who's referred to as the king who exalts himself, right? Above all gods, he mentions him just a few verses earlier. Here, so this is Daniel 12:11. This is Daniel 9:27. All right. So I'll just highlight the same. The regular sacrifice is abolished. We'll do that in green. He will put a stop to the sacrifice. Okay. Abomination of desolation is set up. Put that in blue. In Daniel 9:27, it was mentioned the wing of abominations who makes desolate, okay, because it's the same reference. Okay. And then he says 1,290 days. Notice here, the middle of the 7. All right. The middle of the 7. How many years is that? What's the middle of 7 years?
3.5 years. 3.5 years.
All right. That number is pretty close to the 1,290, isn't it?
Yes.
This corresponds to, so in Daniel 11, there's an extra month that is mentioned here. Okay. 3.5 years plus 1 month equals 1,290 days. Again, we're talking about the lunar calendar. Okay. And in Daniel 9:27, he was just speaking of the 3.5 years. So there's this extra month that is mentioned here. Okay. But notice the similarity between these two verses. Daniel 12:11 is speaking of the 70th week. Okay. And in Daniel 12, we're given a little more detail that basically from the 70th, the middle of the 70th week to the end, there's 1,290 days, which is 3.5 years plus 1 month. Okay. Now, if we go to Revelation, and there's the 7-year tribulation, right? This 1 month, there's the question is, okay, what could this extra month be referring to? Is there a mistake? Should he have said 1,260 days? Or is something else going on here? All right. I think it's just referring, there's after the end of the tribulation, there's like a 1 month period of additional judgment and purging that will take place after the Messiah returns. And there's war around Jerusalem. And then there's, I think Daniel is speaking here of an additional month of, probably cleaning up skirmishes, things like that are taking place. But Yeah, Sandy, you said, look how specific this is. I mean, they mentioned specifically how many days. All right. So from the abomination of desolation to the end, there will be 1,290 days. All right, that's pretty specific. And then he says in verse 12, he adds even one more detail. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. So, hey, say, wait a minute, where are these extra 45 days coming from? What's going on here? Well, I believe, basically, I think what he's describing is this, okay? So you have Daniel's 70th week, right? And in that week, at the beginning, this man named the prince makes a covenant, right, with Israel, with the many, okay? That's at the beginning. Then after 3.5 years, which would be 1,260 days, all right, he breaks the covenant, commits what's called the abomination of desolation. And I believe, and we talked about this when we went through Daniel 9, that as Paul refers to this in 2 Thessalonians when he says the Antichrist will make himself out to be God in the temple. Okay. Now, Daniel doesn't give that detail. He just says there'll be an abomination of desolation, and it's implied it'll be related to the temple, because notice he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Okay, so in the middle, after 3.5 years, we have this man called the prince in Daniel who breaks the covenant, commits abomination. And then Daniel says in Daniel 12 that after 1,290 days after this, comes the end. Okay? So the rest of the tribulation, oops. All right, comes the end. And again, we know this because he's speaking of the events mentioned in Daniel 7. But then we have in verse 12, there's an additional 45 days that are mentioned. Okay, so this, let's see here. So a lot of people question, okay, what are the additional 30 days that are mentioned here? And then what are these additional 45 days?
Grace.
Yeah, I think the best I could think of is this, okay, that there's Armageddon, right? There is Jesus comes, returns, battles Jerusalem, destroys God's enemies. And then over a period of 30 days, there's, additional maybe smaller battles or in other places, somewhere in other places of the world. But it's not until 1,290 days when that is fully done. And then 45 days is probably, because notice it says how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to. I think that's a reference to the millennial kingdom, that it will take another 45 days for Jesus to set up the millennial kingdom where he reigns. Okay, that's my guess. All right. There's a lot of other theories and things, but I think basically you have the 7-year tribulation. In the middle of the tribulation, the Antichrist commits the abomination of desolation. Then the rest of the tribulation's another 3.5 years. Then Jesus returns, and then it takes about 30 days for the judgment to be fully done and all of the enemies to be defeated. And then he sets up his millennial kingdom and that will take a period of 45 days where Jesus will reign from Jerusalem. What's that? I'm sorry, did someone have a question or comment?
So, Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
at the second coming, the enemies of the Lord, I mean, it's not all the enemies of the Lord will be defeated at the battle of the Armageddon, meaning there are still few more enemies around the world that's still to be subdued.
Maybe. That could explain why there's an extra 30 days here. That's involved. You know, that's what I think. So the big battle, you know, is done around Jerusalem, but maybe the full judgment around the world doesn't happen until for another month. That's my best guess as to what those 30 extra days are.
Pastor
Yeah,
Tim,
Sandy? Yeah.
the millennial kingdom, Christ will set up a temple in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
So it is possible that there will be a fourth. My question is, there will be a third kingdom established by the Antichrist when he seated. Does Christ sit that temple or could be destroyed? Then Christ will set up another temple which is not created by man. What do you think?
Yeah, he'll reign from the temple in Jerusalem. That Zechariah clearly describes that. In fact, that was the next passage we're going to look at here in a minute.
Is that temple means the third temple where he seated?
Yeah, the temple is going to be rebuilt. Yes. In Jerusalem. I'll show you. We'll go to Zechariah 14. I'll show that to you. Okay. Before we do that, there's one other thing here to notice. Let's see. Notice verse 13 says, as for you, go your way to the end, then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Seems to be a reference to the resurrection, our bodily resurrection here. So that's interesting. There's a lot of theories there too, but seems to be a possibility. Yeah, Jesse.
Is this resurrection happen? Will this resurrection happen at the second coming or at the great white throne?
First resurrection.
First resurrection.
Well, keep in mind, who is he speaking to here?
Daniel.
Daniel.
I'm just asking.
Right.
If, will this happen at the second coming?
Well, this is Daniel. Okay. Who is an Old Testament saint. And if you remember, when we'll look at Revelation 20, probably next week, the Old Testament saints are brought back to life after at the end, right? I don't think this is speaking of the rapture because of who the audience is here. It's Daniel. Yes. Daniel's not part of the church. He's an Old Testament saint. The Old Testament saints are raised at another point in time.
They will be resurrected before the second or after the second
after
coming.
The second coming.
Because they're promised to reign with the Lord during millennium.
Yeah, if you go to, we'll look at that in Revelation 20. Okay.
Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
As the appointed time of the great battles so imminent, so these two battles, the Armageddon and the Gog and Magog, which one first takes place? Gog and Magog or Armageddon?
Well, you're talking about Ezekiel. Gog and Magog that one I think actually happens. I was talking to Pastor Mel about this a couple years ago, and I would agree with what he said, and what I would agree with is that likely is a reference to some large battle that takes place before the tribulation. That seems to fit better with the other events. So Gog and Magog is not Armageddon. They're separate battles, and I think Gog and Magog takes place before the tribulation, or at the very beginning of it. But that's in Ezekiel, so that's another context.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Okay, so here's the challenge, with these prophecies, there's some quite a bit of detail, but then there's also gaps that aren't really clearly explained all the time, just certain key events. And remember, Daniel was given this instruction and this prophecy in order to encourage him. Okay? God's just trying to communicate to him and let him know, because again, remember, what's Daniel been thinking about? Go back to chapter 9. Daniel's been thinking about Jerusalem is in ruins, the temple is in ruins, they've been in captivity for 70 years, God's people are discouraged, they're kept captive in Babylon, and Daniel's thinking about the future, and or he's thinking about, the present, and how the people are ruined. And so he cries out to God, asking him to keep his promise to restore his people. And so Daniel's given this glimpse of the future in order to encourage him that God is not done with Jerusalem, that God has a plan, and these are some of the events that are going to happen until the end. And then, of course, here he says, how blessed is he who keeps waiting, attains to. So, and then he says at the very last verse, as for you, Daniel, go to the end, literally is what he's saying. Press on, endure until your life is over. And then at a time in the future, you will rise again at the end of the age. So verse 13 reminds us that these future events were given really specifically for Daniel in order to encourage and strengthen him, because he was discouraged and perhaps even doubting, is there really a future for Israel? Jerusalem is destroyed and we're in captivity. And so God gave him this future instruction, the events of the future, as a means to encourage him to just keep enduring, Daniel, keep walking by faith until the end of your life, and you will rise again. I will I will keep my promises, and you will rise again at the end of the age. Okay, so keep this in mind, guys. So when you preach these kinds of texts, remember, don't just preach it because you're telling people what's going to happen in the future. But remember, there's an intent in learning about the future. And you got to find that from the context. And that will be one of the applications that you will be giving to your hearers. You guys understand what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Don't ever preach prophecy just for the sake of telling about future events. That's my point. Certainly, that will be a part of your message, obviously, if you're preaching one of these passages. But always, always remember, there is an intent in learning about the future for the people in the present. And here, I think Daniel 9 through 11 was simply for Daniel first, obviously for us later, but initially, the initial audience in Daniel 9 through 11 is Daniel. Right? And because again, keep in mind, throughout Daniel 9 and 10 and 11, he's referred to as a man of high esteem, right? Gabriel, the great angel Gabriel, is sent to Daniel in order to encourage him. We learn in chapter 10. And so that the encouragement is this: Daniel, here's what God is going to do in the future. He will keep his promise. Jerusalem will be restored. And let me give you some detail of how that's going to happen. And then eventually there will come an end, and God will carry out his judgment. And you just keep going. And then one day you will rise again at that very end. You will see all of this, Daniel. You'll see everything that God has done, and you will rise up and be a part of that blessed event at the end of the age.
Maranatha.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that was the response, I think, or what God is doing and telling him these things, so that Daniel would say that, right? Maranatha. He would say the Hebrew word. What would it be? Bo. It's the word for come. I think he would say something like bo. Bo is, I think, the word. So he would have said Hebrew, but not Greek. Anyway.
So,
Herman, did you have?
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
so, Pastor Tim, if those prophecy only spoken to Daniel only, so how can we say about the timeless truth for that as we preach?
Well, it was spoken to Daniel originally. I wouldn't say Daniel only. Certainly it's meant also for future believers. But you first want to understand, okay, who was this prophecy given to first and why?
Daniel.
Yeah. Okay, in this case, it's given to Daniel specifically. He was the original audience. Why? Why was he given this prophecy? That's what I've been talking about. He was discouraged. He was weary. He was weak. He wasn't eating. And so God sent Gabriel to encourage and strengthen him and to explain to him what was going to happen. So the timeless truth, that's one of, if you look at the application for Daniel, certainly that should be an application for us. I mean, look at all that's happened in the last 18 months, guys. Do you think people are discouraged? Do you think people might be wondering, where is this world going? This is hopeless. Do you think people might be wondering, is God still paying attention? Why is he letting all of this happen? That's at times when God will reveal future events in order to encourage people who are struggling. Yeah, Sandy.
And this is amen.
Our God is coming sooner.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, timeless truth, it's a really good question, Herman, that we want to understand. Okay, so what is the timeless truth here? If Daniel is the original audience, how does it apply to us? Well, certainly these events are still yet future, right? Jesus is coming back and he will set up his kingdom. And so, like Daniel, when we are discouraged and maybe wonder, where's the world going? And is there really any hope in the future? Will God keep his promises? God tells Daniel, yes, Daniel, I will keep my promises. Again, notice what he says, that very last verse, and this is the last verse of the book of Daniel. As for you, okay, Daniel, okay, I've told you all this stuff. What's going to happen? And that Jerusalem is not done, that I do have a plan. As for you, Daniel, so here's what I want you to do in response to what I just told you. Go to the end. What he says literally. Let me see, what does the ESV say? Go your way till the end of the New King James. Yeah, go your way till the end. Basically saying, keep going, don't give up, don't be discouraged, because you shall rest, you shall die, but you will rise again at the end. Daniel, how could Daniel be assured of that? Because God just says, look, these are my future plans for Israel, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to keep my promise, take them out of the exile, and Jerusalem will be rebuilt, right? Going back to Daniel 9, but there will be some time of turmoil and conflict at the very end. What did he call it here in Daniel 12? Time of trouble or time of distress. Okay, I just want to make sure, as we talk about these things, that you guys just always keep in mind there is a purpose and intent in these prophecies, not just to know what's going to happen, but that there's an expected response on our part as we hear these prophecies, an expected response in us. It should move us to live a godly life. Again, notice he tells Daniel, go your way till the end. Keep living life as you have been, Daniel, in integrity, in holiness, in godliness. Don't give up. Don't be discouraged.
Keep persevering.
Same message to us.
I think it could be an encouraging moment today, the last verse of Daniel. For us as a pastors who work in the God's kingdom and in the time of testing, especially this time when we got discouraged, could be, for me, it could be a hopeful morning. Thank you, Pastor Kim.
Yeah,
Pastor Tim.
that's right. That's good, Sandy. It is
Question,
for
Pastor
us.
Tim.
Yeah, Eric.
In all of these scriptures that we have talked about, Pastor Tim, in your own opinion or understanding, why is it up to this point of time there's still a lot of interpretation regarding the end times?
You mean, why is there differing opinions and views, you mean?
Different interpretations about the end times.
Well, I think we see an example. I mean, that's a great question. We see an example from it in Daniel, where we're given some information, but not all the information. And so people try to fill in what's missing, like 1,290 days, the 1,335 days. Okay, what are those extra days? Or even Sandy mentioned it earlier, sort of joking, 1,290 days, is that literal? Well, some people would say no, because their hermeneutic, their rule of interpretation is they see Old Testament prophecy as more figurative than literal. So that's pardon me?
Symbols.
Yeah. But I would say, well, notice he says 1,290, then 1,335. If those are figurative, why would he use such specific numbers and they be different? Right? I mean, that wouldn't make sense, would it? If he had said, in 1,000 days, and then in another 1,000 days, but he's specific. And he gives numbers that are consistent with what he said in Daniel 9:27, in the middle of the 7 years. That's 3.5 years. That's 1,260 days. So I think it is literal and very specific, but it, different men have a different interpretive approach. Some look at these Old Testament prophecies and sort of presume it's mostly symbolic and figurative, because parts of these prophecies are symbolic, right? There are symbols in prophetic literature, but I think some would interpret that most of the prophecy in a symbolic or figurative way, where others, like me, would look at it more literally. And so if you do that, that will cause you to maybe have two different perspectives. Now, one thing we want to always remember, guys, especially with other people who may have a different view on end times, is almost everybody agrees that, there's a second coming, the Christ is coming again. All right, so that future event, there's not much disagreement, okay? Which is good, because that's the key event, his second coming. right? There is disagreement on what happens right before that and right after that. Some would say, well, there's a 7-year tribulation, which is what I believe, because I interpret prophecies like in Daniel literally. So I said that that last 7, the 70th 7, I say that's a literal 7-year period. Others may not, but we all agree Jesus is coming back. So their disagreement, though, is there a tribulation and a rapture that happens before that? And then others would argue over what happens after the second coming. Does Jesus have a millennial reign on earth, or are we all brought into the eternal state? You know, some would say there is no literal reign on earth. Others say there is. I believe there is because, again, my approach to the prophetic text is to first take it literally, unless something in the passage indicates that we should see it either figuratively or symbolically. And so, like, if we're looking at Daniel here, for example, all right, and we see here, you know, at the end of Daniel, these time periods, 1290 days, 1335 days, the end of the age, you know, I'm taking these as literal. The regular sacrifice, that there is a sacrifice that is stopped. All right, because so far, all of the things that are mentioned here, we assume first that these are literal. Okay, unless there's something in the text that makes it clear that it is symbolic or figurative. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Eric, but a lot of it has to do with whether or not, sorry, Jess, give me a second. A lot of it has to do with whether or not the person assumes that a text is literal or assumes that it's figurative and symbolic. All right, and that decision will affect the conclusion. But despite that, everyone, at least believers who are evangelical, agrees that there's a second coming of the Messiah, and that's most important. Jeff?
Pastor Tim, I have some. I just want to ask this question, though I already have answers in mind, but I just want to hear from you. What's the greatest? I would say, what is your strongest argument in favor of literal interpretation, or strongest support?
Authorial intent. For example, you know, when in Daniel 9, when we were looking at that passage, okay, and it came up again in Daniel 11. But when we're talking about here, you are to know and discern from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. Okay, now who is he speaking to? Daniel, right? So he's saying, so you, Daniel, are to know and discern from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Now, what would Daniel understand that to mean? And more importantly, what would the intended author hear is God speaking through Gabriel, or Gabriel speaking for God to Daniel? Okay, if he's not referring to the actual literal Jerusalem being rebuilt, what is he referring to, and how would Daniel know that? Okay, there has to be something here that would tell Daniel, okay, Daniel, I'm not really talking about Jerusalem. That's a symbol for God's people or something else. How would Daniel know that?
That's a video.
Okay, so we have to take into account who is speaking, to whom is he speaking, and what's the authorial intent. Right, that to me is an argument for a literal interpretation that what is said we should take literally unless there are some obvious clues from the author that it's symbolic, or like, for example, go back further in Daniel 7. I think Sandy referred to this. Daniel 8 even. Notice Daniel had a dream about a ram and a goat. And here the author says, the ram which you saw with 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, the ram there was not literal in this vision. It was symbolic. How do I know that? Because the author tells me. Okay, and then verse 21, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. Okay, again, all right, the goat that was in the vision wasn't literal, it was a symbol, because the author explains it. Okay, when we get to chapter like 11 that we read earlier here, went through together, he talks about, okay, in the first year of Darius the Mede, is that literal? I would assume so, right? He's just saying, look, the first year, Darius, I arose to be an encouragement and protection for him, for this king. So Daniel's speaking here. All right. Now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Okay. Is this speaking of literal Persia? Well, he just mentioned Darius the Mede, who was appointed by Cyrus. Cyrus, the king of Persia. Darius was appointed to be the ruler over the region of Babylon. Okay. So far, right, we're given a literal name, Darius. We're given a literal place, Persia. All right. And he, that is the king of Persia, will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Again, a literal place, and a mighty king will arise. So there's got to be something in the context that tells me it is figurative. I assume it's literal until I'm told otherwise, or until there's something in what is said. So here it's literal. The king of the south, the southern area, will grow strong, and after some years they'll form an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will come. There's nothing here that tells me this is figurative. All right. It's just going through actual history. 4 kings that arise and the conflict that takes place between them. These 4 kings come from Greece, which was broken up. And by the way, guys, if you study the history of the Grecian Empire, it exactly follows what happens here in Daniel 11, which further confirms this prophecy is literal. Okay, so another argument I would say, Jesse, is just look at the prophecies so far that have been fulfilled, and then go back to those prophecies and ask, were they fulfilled literally? Right? As for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, from you one will go forth for me to be a ruler. Okay, was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Was the Messiah born in Bethlehem? Yes. Right? So in that prophecy in Micah, when it says Bethlehem, it means Bethlehem. So here when we see, Greece and Persia and Jerusalem, unless we're told that that represents something else, then it is Greece or Persia or Jerusalem or Darius the Mede or whoever's referred to. Okay, so I think those are for me the two strong arguments. Is I approach prophecy as I do any other passage, which is I approach it knowing that there's authorial intent, meaning that the original author was intended to communicate a message to the original hearer, that the original hearer would understand. Okay, so if there's some mysterious symbolic meaning here, then notice, if you read, just go back tonight or later today, read through Daniel 7, 8, 9, the last half of Daniel. Notice that in some cases, Daniel's given a vision and that vision is explained to him. And any symbols in that vision are explained to him. Okay, so he does receive visions that have symbolic references in it, symbols, right? We remember from Daniel 7, the beasts that rise up. Those are symbols, and they're explained as symbols. So the original hearer, Daniel, can understand. So if you don't see, like in Daniel 11, we don't see this saying like, okay, Persia, you know, when Persia is mentioned here, where is that again? The kings are going to rise in Persia, and Persia really is a symbol for, we don't see that here because it's literal Persia that's being referred to. That's how Daniel would have understood it. And if the author had meant something else, he would tell Daniel what he actually meant. Does that make, do you guys follow me? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Makes
Pastor
sense,
Tim.
Pastor Tim.
Yes,
Okay.
Thank
Makes
you.
sense.
Thank you so much, Pastor Tim. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. So yeah, authorial intent
Pastor Tim.
is a key. All right. We'll have to wait till next week to look at Zechariah 14. We're going to go back over this because Zechariah 14 to me is one of the clearest demonstrations that Jesus will reign from Jerusalem, literally. And I think Zechariah 14 is the strongest case for that. All right. So we'll have to wait till next week when we go through that. I think it's an excellent example. In fact, yeah, I've got Zechariah over here. But I think Zechariah is a great example or great passage that tells us explicitly the Messiah will return to earth and he will reign on earth. We aren't told how long. That doesn't actually come. And this is interesting. We're not told how long the Messiah will reign until the very last or almost the very last chapter of the Bible. That's when that number 1000 comes in. But up until then, no passage tells us the exact how long the Messiah will reign. Which led some rabbis to believe the Messiah's reign would be forever, like he would reign on earth forever. And I guess in a sense, right, heaven will be on earth, right? The new heavens, New Jerusalem is going to come down on the earth. So really heaven is the earth. If you hadn't thought about that before, it's going to be a rebuilt earth, a new earth, but we will live forever. The eternal state will be actually on the earth in the New Jerusalem, not up in the sky. So anyway, there are some songs that talk about that. Heaven is a place on earth. That's actually true. Not today, but in the future. Heaven will be brought to earth, essentially. Anyway, sorry, long answer to your question, Jesse, but I think it's an important one. How do we know that the literal interpretation is the best? Well, because at the end of the day, it comes down to authorial intent. And what would the original reader understand from the original author? It has to mean something to the original audience. Otherwise, authorial intent, you just throw that out. It doesn't matter. If this prophecy is really not for you, it's for a group of people in the future, then that to me is a problem. If God was giving a prophecy to Daniel that really wasn't meant for him, it was meant for people in the future. So it was all symbols that Daniel wouldn't understand, and it's all figurative, and only we later can understand that. Well, I have a problem with that, especially as we saw in Daniel, it was meant for him, and the very last words are to Daniel of what to do in response to this prophecy. So certainly God intended for Daniel to understand what he was saying. And it's the same for every other prophecy. The author wants his hearers, his audience, to understand. Otherwise, you can't, authorial intent doesn't matter anymore. Then it's like, okay, then then you can have any kind of interpretation you want, because there's nothing controlling that. So anyway, I have a strong conviction about this issue, because I really believe in God speaking through the author to the original audience first, and that the message is first for them. So anyway, sorry, Jesse, it's a short question, but I think it's a really important one.
Yes,
Very
you are.
important one.
Yes,
So, Pastor Tim, so the
Ako,
band,
sa imo, introduce ba to, Jess?
Sorry, Herman.
Pastor Tim, so we can say that the vantage point of Book of Daniel is few of those prophecies are being fulfilled, and we can understand it easily because there were passages that so literal. So when we're talking about Book of Revelation, so those are there are passages in the Book of Revelations that not yet literally fulfilled. So how can we deal with that?
Yeah. So again, I would say look at, do we interpret those literally or figuratively? There will be clues in the passage that will tell us if it should be interpreted literally or figuratively or symbolically. Because look at the prophecies that have been fulfilled. They've been fulfilled literally. Okay, the Messiah Prince was cut off, for example. He was born in Bethlehem. The potter's field was sold for 30 pieces of silver. At the cross, Jesus's bones were not broken. I mean, he was born of a virgin. He was literally born from a virgin woman, right? Isaiah 7:14. So if you look at the prophecies and the ones that have been fulfilled, they've been fulfilled literally. So that tells me that any prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled are still going to be fulfilled literally. Unless in the prophecy, there is an explanation that something is symbolic or figurative. Okay. And like I said, just go back later today, guys, read through Daniel 7-12, and you'll see that some of the prophecies, there's symbols there, and the symbols are explained. Other prophecies, there's no symbols because there's none that are explained. It's meant literally. Okay. So that tells me that, yeah, at times God uses symbols in future events to tell future events, but those symbols are explained as a symbol. Okay. And when you don't have an explanation of something as a symbol, that means it's not a symbol. It's literal. Okay. So I think you'll see that if you just read through Daniel 7-12. You'll see sometimes they're symbols and they're explained, and other times they're not. But the intent all the way through is that Daniel would understand. Because if he doesn't understand, how is he going to be encouraged? Which was the whole reason that these visions were given to him and explained.
Yeah.
Okay. Because again, that's why verse 13, the very last verse of Daniel is so important, guys, because it tells us those visions were given to him for a purpose. To encourage him to keep going. Okay. So he would have to understand them. And God wanted him to understand. If he didn't, if there were mystery, he wouldn't be encouraged. Yeah. Somebody have a question?
And also, Pastor, the way they understand the prophecy, like Daniel, he also understand it literally. Because when he read the book of Jeremiah, that says that 70 years.
Yep.
That's the way he understand it.
Exactly.
Years.
That's a great illustration. Yeah. Daniel understood it literally, right? He said, I've been reading Jeremiah. Jeremiah said 70 years. So let's see. It's been 70 years. Lord, will you, right? It wasn't symbolic. And that's why I think it's interesting that in response to Daniel's request, his prayer, that the prophecy he's given includes the number 70. And God tells him 77s, though. It's not 70 years, but 70 sevens of years. And so there's a connection there. It's a literal 70. The 70 years of exile and the 70 sevens. So yeah, Daniel assumed it was literal. That's a great point, Jesse. All right, any other comments or questions? That's enough? Does your head hurt?
Yeah. We enjoyed Pastor Tim. Thank you so much. I would just my problem is just to want to catch up with the assignments because I'm way behind.
Well,
Life happens, and I still have a lot of assignments to catch up Pastor Tim because of so many things happening. Anyway, I believe that the Lord help me. I will be
That's a tribulation, Brother Jess.
sweet tribulation.
Is that your
Just
day of
kidding.
distress? The day of trouble? Well, that's why I'm taking a little time now. I thought it would be good and just, have these discussions for a few weeks so that you can hopefully be able to catch up on your assignments a little bit.
Yes.
So, we'll probably spend a couple more weeks doing these, looking at some more passages, talking about them before we get back to the assignments and the next step in the process. So try to take advantage. I know you're busy, holidays are coming up too. So there'll be a break there as well. We'll probably stop in the middle of December and, take 3 or 4 weeks for the Christmas holidays and things. So hopefully you can catch up a little bit there too. And, we'll see. I'm hoping that, the Philippines will open up and I can travel there, early next year. So we'll just have to see what happens.
Oh.
But do what you can. I know it's been really hard. It's been really hard. This is crazy. So I'd hate for you guys to. I know you put so much work into this course already. So I'd hate to see anybody quit just because of what's happened the last year and a half. But hoping everyone can try to get back to speed and caught up, and so we can finish this together. Not let COVID defeat us.
Yeah.
But
By the way, Pastor Tim, the way you deal us in this Zoom teachings about this TIA, it takes a lot of advantage for us. Yeah. Imagine if you teach us physically, it takes only 5 days. But now in Zoom, it takes a month.
or
More
longer.
months. So yeah. So we're becoming equipped and learn so much from you. Yeah. COVID pa more.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad.
Fourth and fifth wave.
Yeah.
Oh.
Because 5 days, it is not enough, especially for this course.
Plano balik Pastor Herman's late.
Yeah. So we will gain more advantage for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And too, even if we get back to doing the in-class module, I would like to, keep doing Zoom after that so we can So when we get to module 5, even just going over it in together, but then maybe do Zoom like we're doing after that to go over things again, to go over assignments, things like that. So, all right, guys, well, I'll let you go. It's lunchtime. So great questions, though. Really good insights too from you guys. So thank you for persevering and being a part of this. It's really been helpful to me. Just the questions you ask and the comments you have have been good for me to think about too. So I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. John, I don't know if you're there. You've been kind of quiet today. Good. Hey, can you close us in prayer?
Sorry, my wife had a meeting, so.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
Okay,
Good to have you. Can you close in prayer?
Okay, let's pray. Father,